Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can I ask everybody to begin to take their seat? So my name is Edward Cameron, and I am Director of Partnership Development and Research at BSR. It's my great pleasure to manage the full spectrum of relationships that we have as an organization with civil society, with philanthropic organizations, with governments, and with multilateral organizations. It's also my job at BSR to help shepherd the wonderful ideas that are created right across our organization into full fruition by managing our research process. I'm here today with the great honor of introducing our plenary speaker for the afternoon, and it would be very easy for me to introduce our speaker with a long list of her biography and her resume. But to do that would take far too much time and would not do justice to the remarkable roles and achievements that she has spanning many, many decades. So instead, I'm going to tell a story. I first encountered Mary Robinson as a very shy and inarticulate 15-year-old in Ireland. I was the last person you could possibly imagine to be willing to stand up in front of an audience and speak about anything. But I was inspired to speak in front of my entire school in order to champion the candidacy for president of a very new type of leader. This was a leader who was modern in a very traditional society, a leader that was inclusive, and most of all, a leader who was qualified not only to defend our Constitution, but to represent the best of our nation to the world. I was very fortunate many, many years later to have the opportunity to work with our plenary speaker on the issue of climate justice, the vital interface between climate change and human rights. I was fortunate to work with Mary Robinson on strengthening the resilience of vulnerable populations in the face of climate impacts today and helping to ensure that those same vulnerable populations have access to sustainable development as we go forward. I learned a number of things by working with Mary Robinson that are relevant for our conference. I learned that some people derive power from the titles they have, CEO of this or president of that. Some people derive power as a consequence of the networks they possess, the people that they can phone in times of crisis. But some people derive power based purely on who they are as a human being. Their compassion, their integrity, their intelligence, and they're willing to share their own power to give voice to those who are voiceless. I am very, very proud to have had the opportunity to work with Mary Robinson, and I'm delighted today to ask you to invite Mary Robinson to the stage and to welcome my hero to the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, Mary Robinson.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. You know, it was Jonathan Swift, I think, who said that the Irish are very fair people. They never speak well of each other. But Edward has somehow made that less true. It's really very enjoyable to be back here in the Forum of Business for Social Responsibility. Aaron just told me a few minutes ago that apparently I'm one of two people to address the forum a second time. I do remember it was about, I think, 14 years ago here in San Francisco, speaking for the first time. And I do so as an elder. I'm not going to have any PowerPoint, no exciting gadgets. You'll just have to listen to me. And it's actually a pleasure, even though I haven't been here very long today, having come from Memphis this morning, to have met a number of people whom I've worked with in the past. And I have that same feeling, in a sense, that Edward was talking about, of the pleasure of working with people that you really like and respect. When I spoke at this conference, as I say, about 14 years ago, the United States and California in particular were economically on the crest of a wave. New technologies created here contributed hugely to the economic expansion of the time. It was a very buoyant time. But there was also growing awareness that consumers and investors were becoming more informed and more demanding of corporations for the responsibility that they would have to show. They would have to become more accountable for the social and environmental impacts of their activities wherever they operated. I think we've made valuable progress over recent years in acknowledging that all businesses do indeed have their own responsibility to respect human rights. The work of John Ruggie, in his time as Special Representative of the Secretary-General at the United Nations, has established an extraordinary consensus between governments that business must play a role in providing effective remedies for harm caused to human rights, but also act to prevent future harms from occurring. I know from my own experience over several years as chair of the Business Leaders Initiative on Human Rights, and then as a founding chair and now patron of the Institute for Human Rights in Business, that business can in fact achieve great things when it sees human rights not as a constraint, but as integral to the future of any sustainable business. And that's beginning to happen more and more. And we're seeing companies that are comfortable with being able to incorporate human rights values and use the UN guiding principles on human rights. This time in speaking to you, and I think Edward flagged this quite well, I come wearing a different hat, the hat of my foundation, the Mary Robinson Foundation, Climate Justice. While the concept of climate justice may sound a little bit unrelated to the previous work on business and human rights, I'm in fact convinced, and more convinced, that there are such real connections that it's part of the same issue. Climate justice, in fact, links development and human rights, and is, I believe, part of any conversation now about business and human rights. Climate justice refers to the fact that the people least responsible for climate change are all too often those who are most affected by its impacts. Basic human rights, such as the right to food, to water, to health, to education, to shelter, to life itself, are being undermined today because of environmental changes that we're contributing to on a profound scale. It was during my years as head of Realising Rights, and Heather Grady, who's here, was the managing director of Realising Rights. It was during those years, while we were focusing on economic and social rights and working with African countries on health issues, on corporate responsibility, on women, peace and security, that I became aware of the extent of the problem. The way in which it was put was a sentence that usually began with, but things are so much worse. Things are so much worse because we can no longer predict when the rainy seasons will come. Things are so much worse because we used to have predictable climate, and now we have long periods of drought followed by flash flooding. And I was really struck by how serious that is when you don't have insurance, you don't have a plan B, you don't have a federal program. It's so devastating for the livelihoods of farmers, for those who are suddenly constrained by long periods of drought and have to go even further for water. The whole impact was undoubtedly as serious a human rights impact as you would want to see, and the predictions of displacement of people were going to cause more conflict. Indeed, we know that part of the conflict in Darfur in the Sudan was because of drought driving pastoralists further and causing communities that didn't intermingle before to intermingle and ultimately to give rise to strife. For future generations, the consequences of continuing on the same carbon-emitting path are of unimaginable severity to all of the society, including, of course, business, with enormous operational, financial, and reputational risk. Keeping the temperature at the safe level within 2 degrees Celsius or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit is the only just and safe approach the world can take to step away from the brink of a catastrophic future. I was recently in the presence of Christiana Figueres. She actually came to Cape Town, where the elders were meeting, this group that Nelson Mandela brought together, which used to be chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Now Kofi Annan is our chair. And we have been meeting for the last 6 years, since our establishment in 2007, on conflict issues in countries. Lakhdar Brahimi, who currently has the mandate in relation to Syria, is one of the elders. Some of our members were recently in Burma, Myanmar, and that's an area of great interest to the world of business and human rights. But she wanted to engage us on the issue of climate change because she believes it's so serious and there isn't the leadership that is needed. And she did a little trick beforehand, or I'm not sure if I should call it a trick, and I've seen she's done it more recently when speaking in Chatham House, so clearly this is her way of conveying how we have reached a new era and need to be aware of it. What she did was very simple. She said, I want everyone, before I really begin my talk to you, I want each of you to take a deep breath. And so we took a deep breath, and she said, now just realize you are breathing a new kind of air. This year in May, we passed 400 parts per million of carbon, the first time in millions of years. No other human beings have ever breathed that same air. And it was a kind of simple way of bringing home something really very serious, that changes are happening that are becoming irreversible, that are becoming very serious for the future of our planet. And are we doing enough to address those issues? So if you look at it from the perspective of climate justice, it means accountability for harms done, but it also means taking steps today to prevent future harms. There's no doubt that our parents and our grandparents were unaware when they were benefiting from fossil fuel development, when they were driving motor cars, when they were heating their buildings, when they were using electricity that was based on fossil fuel, of the impacts. But we know and have known for some time, and we cannot, therefore, say that it was something that we were not aware of. The progress that has been made on the broad business and human rights agenda, I think, can inform the steps needed to achieve climate justice for all. For example, we know that fulfilling the corporate responsibility to respect human rights in line with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights requires companies to undertake due diligence, including through impact assessments that should include environmental and human rights factors in an integrated way. Due diligence also means that business needs to understand its role, not only from the perspective of each company, but also the broader impacts that industry sectors can have in specific countries and regions. I'm actually pleased that my friend John Morrison, whom I spent some time with this afternoon, the Executive Director of the Institute for Human Rights in Business, is also speaking here this week. And he'll be sharing with all of you how governments, business and civil society are currently working together on sector-wide impact assessments in countries such as Burma and soon also in parts of East Africa. In order to solve climate change, development and human rights challenges, we need to think past current silos and consider these issues in a more integrated way. For more than 20 years, BSR has been at the forefront of strengthening the sustainability efforts of companies across the world. And the latest initiative, Business in a Climate-Constrained World, could not come at a more opportune moment in time. We find ourselves at an unprecedented juncture in global development. 2015 is a very special year, a year of important architecture for development. It has been set as the deadline for both the post-2015 development agenda and a new international climate agreement. For real progress to be made in both, the stark findings of the latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change must be heeded. Indeed, must be taken absolutely seriously. If they're not, the business as usual approach will lead us to a 4 degrees Celsius warmer world, which holds unimaginable consequences for humankind, as the World Bank reported recently in a report, Turn Down the Heat. I think it's a report that should remind us all that we are in a new era, we are in a new moment of time. Alongside the theme of business in a climate-constrained world, I'm pleased that BSR plans to focus on the theme of business in an inclusive economy, with a focus on empowering all segments of society to meet their needs, shape their futures, and achieve their potential. This is very much a climate justice idea. I think climate justice can provide a nexus to both. In many countries and cultures, marginalized groups such as women, indigenous communities, and the poor are at the forefront of living with and coping with the reality of the injustices caused by climate change. They're critically aware of the importance of climate justice in contributing to the right to development, and indeed all other human rights being recognized, and can play a vital role as agents of change within their communities. The theme of business in an inclusive economy aims to respect and strengthen those rights through giving voice to all, which working towards universal access to essential goods and services and providing quality work and economic opportunities. I saw in a conference which my foundation organised with the Irish government last April the difference it makes when those who are the experts, who really know the problem on the ground, take part on equal terms. The conference was called, it was a conference on hunger, nutrition, climate justice. And of the 300 participants, 100 were from communities directly affected by climate around the world. It was a conference during Ireland's presidency of the European Union, so there were ministers and commissioners from other member states of Europe there, and they sat at tables like you sitting at, or circles, with members of communities and heard their voices directly. And I loved one quote in particular where a woman from Zambia said, you know, we don't think out of the box because we don't think in boxes, you know. It's holistic, it affects us very directly. And it was that kind of straight talking that made quite a difference. We don't need to look to the future to see the enormous impacts climate change is having on business. From Hurricane Katrina and Superstorm Sandy here in the United States to devastating floods in India and drought in Namibia, the need to build resilience in communities across the globe is loud and clear. The Munich Re Insurance Group reported that in 2012, more than 800 weather-related events caused an estimated 130 billion in economic losses, making it the third costliest year on record, behind 2011 and 2005. But despite the growing evidence of unpredictable weather shocks becoming more frequent and severe, the vast majority of companies continue to plan based on past weather events and experience, and few have tried to look ahead by integrating the increasing risks posed by a changed climate into their operations. This lack of foresight will continue to cause economic and societal damage at enormous costs if things don't change. Therefore, resilience is the key, not just for economic advancement, but for societal justice. National and international leaders can encourage climate adaptation and resilience building through providing incentives and engaging in public-private partnerships. They can create policy certainty on future investment models that prioritizes sustainable alternatives. They can allow national and international legal frameworks to evolve to ensure everyone is protected in an increasingly unpredictable climate, while ensuring the effective enforcement of climate-related policies. I recall, after that conference on hunger, nutrition, and climate justice, speaking with Aaron Kramer, who had come specially to a business meeting, a business breakfast, which we had after the conference to avail of the presence of people like Paul Polman and Al Gore and others who'd come for the conference, because we wanted to encourage the private sector to think about climate justice and to learn about a climate justice dialogue, which is an initiative that my foundation and the World Resources Institute have launched. And Ed Edward, when he was working with the World Resources Institute, did a lot of the preliminary thinking about this climate justice dialogue. It aims to mobilize political will and creative thinking to shape an equitable and ambitious international climate agreement in 2015. You can find further details about the climate justice dialogue in the website either of my foundation at www.mrfcj.org or indeed the website of the World Resources Institute. What we're saying is we have to change the narrative on climate. We have to have new constituencies of demand for a climate agreement, because if we don't put a ceiling on emissions in a rigorous way and in a fair and robust way and stay below 2 degrees Celsius, then all the consequences for the next decade or so, but also for the future, will be irreversible. At the meeting in Dublin, the discussion on business and climate justice, Aaron brought up some important points: that the current models for measuring and reporting are broken, and that there's a need to look at sustainability as a sustained societal value. Financial reports alone can no longer be considered the only measure of a corporation's value. As the public becomes increasingly aware of how their products are sourced and more motivated to act due to the rise of social media, the need for companies to be accountable for their actions continues to grow. Therefore, business needs to redouble its efforts in order to achieve a social license to operate. Transparency and accountability are no longer optional extras for a successful organization. They're essential in winning over the credibility and trust of their potential customers. It's against this backdrop of increased socio-political pressure that a new model of investment can gain momentum. More and more organizations are coming round to the fact that in order to stay below an increase of more than 2 degrees Celsius in global temperatures, major fossil fuel reserves must be left in the ground. In its report, Redrawing the Energy Climate Map, the International Energy Agency outlines how this trajectory can be maintained up to 2020 at no net economic cost. In fact, the IEA notes that delaying such climate action would be the more expensive option. While $1.5 trillion in low-carbon investments would be avoided before 2020, it would take $5 trillion in additional investments thereafter to get back on track. Furthermore, in their report, The 3% Solution, the World Wildlife Fund and the Carbon Disclosure Project state that the US corporate sector can achieve cost savings of up to $190 billion in 2020 if they reduce emissions by 3% annually by committing to ambitious but feasible climate action. Suddenly, the future of companies which rely heavily on such fuels becomes uncertain. It is very radical, but it's what the IEA is saying, that 2/3 of the known fossil fuel reserves should stay in the ground. And at the same time, green growth shows the potential as a reliable alternative, creating jobs and encouraging investment in sustainable industries. Divestment campaigns across the United States and beyond are highlighting this message with considerable success. You'll know of these campaigns, particularly in colleges here in the United States, but also moving to Europe and beyond. A recent report by the Generation Foundation entitled Stranded Carbon Assets: How and Why Carbon Risks Should Be Incorporated in Investment Analysis foresees risks to investors in carbon-fueled industries arising from future regulation, market forces, and continued public agitation, leading to a revoked social license to operate. The authors therefore suggest that investors should identify the carbon risks in all current and future investments, engage those in charge of business to mitigate and disclose carbon risks, diversify investments into organizations preparing for a low-carbon economy, and divest fossil fuel-intensive assets. Clearly, renewable energy can be the signal to investors that a company is planning for the future. The International Trade Union Confederation and others are now realizing that a just transition to low-carbon, climate-resilient pension investment can drive the creation of decent green jobs, improve social protection, and develop worker skills suitable in a sustainable economy. Before concluding, and I'll be happy to take some questions, initially I think from Aaron, and then from you on the floor, I have a few questions of my own to pose for all of you. I've got to that stage in life, being a designated elder, being a grandmother, where I'm also licensed to be a bit bossy and to try to challenge people, try to get some action around here. So let me ask you first of all, what more can each of you do, individually and collectively, to foster a generation of business people that kickstart a new way of doing business that's fair, upholds human rights, builds resilience in all societies, and makes the transition to low-carbon development? It's in your interests, as I've tried to say, but I think we need to see more leadership. Can we work together to give leadership in climate justice to business, to solve problems, to find solutions and demonstrate what can be done? I think if we take sectors, it's possible to work in a networking way, which is the theme of this annual meeting of BSR, and try to find solutions which showcase successes in moving to a low-carbon economy, and also doing so in a way that promotes access to clean energy, affordable clean energy for all. And can BSR provide a platform for sharing experiences and forging new ideas on climate justice, including on new strategic areas of an inclusive economy and business in a climate-constrained world? Many of you have already applied commendable leadership in the area of human rights and business by taking seriously the UN guiding principles. Though I was recently in discussion with somebody whom I admire greatly in this area of business and human rights, Mike Posner, who's now, as many of you would know, a professor in the business school in New York University. And Mike made the point, which I think we need to think about, that there is a kind of UN guiding principles light emerging. In other words, using the approach but not actually ingesting it fully, not taking it seriously enough substantively in corporations. At the same time, I think considerable work has been done, and the structure of the guiding principles has proved to be very helpful. So what I would like to urge is that companies take the same level of commitment in making the connection between the urgent challenges of climate change, human rights, and development, in other words, the climate justice approach, and change the way business around the world uses its influence to leverage action to achieve climate justice. I was saying to a few of you earlier at more private meetings that this is an issue that needs a leadership that we're not seeing. And to some extent, the problem is that the cycle for many elected representatives, government ministers, government leaders, is rather short, and there's the urgency of the next election and the focus on issues that will help get elected or re-elected. But we don't have time. We're running out of time on this issue. We're in a situation that I was very conscious of yesterday. I've just come from Memphis, Tennessee, where I was, among others, being honored by the National Civil Rights Museum, and I inevitably found myself talking about climate justice. And I borrowed a phrase from that dream speech of Martin Luther King that has stayed with me ever since I heard that speech when I was preparing for law school in August 1963 in Dublin. I was about to start in September, and that speech of Martin Luther King reminded me of why I wanted to study law as an instrument for social change and justice. But I remember that phrase, the fierce urgency of now. He was speaking, to that mall in Washington about the fierce urgency of addressing the issues of racism, of the need to change. That phrase is just as apt and appropriate for climate justice. The fierce urgency of now. And that we all have to do much more than we had been doing. And that's my essential message. And now I'm very happy to welcome Aaron to come up and ask me some easy questions, I hope. Thank you very much.
Mary, it is always an honor and a privilege to be with you. Thank you so much for being with us. I was pretty jet lagged when I was in Dublin. I don't think I was nearly as articulate as what you played back, but thank you very much. And you have license to be what you call bossy anytime with us, even though I think it's actually just providing a strong moral voice that we need to hear. So thank you very much. So you were in political life for some time, and I think one of the things, certainly in the United States, that we tend to struggle with, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on, is how do we create more of a sense in the public of the fierce urgency of now with respect to climate change on its own terms, let alone climate justice? What would you like to see happen in that regard?
Well, I've certainly thought a lot about how to bring home the sense of urgency. And I'm convinced that the only way we will do it is if we change the whole thinking and narrative about climate change. There is a tendency for people to think of climate change as being about science, about melting glaciers, about it's difficult and contentious, and that's the image that comes across. It's actually about people, and it's about development, and it's about human rights. And it's about something that I think a lot of people care a lot about. We provide this country, particularly organizations in this country, are incredibly generous at supporting development of poor communities. I mean, organizations like CARE, and there's so many others who have a long and honorable record, and the USAID, and it's similar with other countries. We feel an obligation. And yet, climate change could undermine very shortly all of the development aid. It could actually, because it's undermining food security at a time when populations are growing very fast in the countries concerned. And so that's one way to try and bring home. I also think that possibly for people who live in societies that still aren't deeply affected, we should talk about intergenerational justice and communicate that idea. I mean, I quite often talk as a proud Irish grandmother that I have 4 grandchildren, and actually I'm working on my 5th, but 2 in Dublin and 2 in Barcelona, and they're still young. They'll be in their 40s in 2050. They'll share the world with 9 billion other people, more or less, and I wonder what that climate-constrained world will be like. And I have this strange sense now of hearing their voices. And I hear 2 kinds of voices. One says, thank goodness that in 2015 they helped by the 2 big decisions on post-2015, and we got a climate agreement. It wasn't perfect, but it set us on the right course. It set all the right signals. Or, and I'm afraid that's the voice I tend to hear, how could they have been so selfish? How could they have been so cruel? Did they not know what it was going to be like for us? And that's the voice I hear, which is what kind of drives me. And I think this mustn't become negative, because there's an opportunity side. And life could be much better for many millions of people if we move rapidly to a low-carbon economy. But I worry about those voices looking back at our failure of leadership.
Building a better world, or in this case, just securing a world that can thrive for children and grandchildren that is about as universal a value as there is. I think that's very, very powerful. From the perspective of political leaders, you made a very good point. It's I think, fair and frequently done to talk about the short-term thinking that infects the world of business. There's no doubt that's true, but there's a school of thought which is also true that governmental leaders actually think even more short-term. So do you see any way to unlock that equation? You talk with political leaders all the time. What's holding them back?
Well, it's interesting in this country that
yes, it is.
You have a president who understands about climate change. You have a Secretary of State, John Kerry, who I would say is probably one of the most informed foreign ministers, if not the most informed, on climate change at the moment. There's a problem somewhere else, I seem to think. I won't go to that. But actually, what I am concerned about, given that I have a big focus on climate justice as a focus on developing countries, and then I also have another responsibility now in Africa as the UN Special Envoy for the Great Lakes. And I meet a lot with African heads of state as part of my work, and I always bring up the climate issue. And they will privately tell you how worried they are. Every one of them now, every single one of them, but they don't say it publicly. The reason they don't say it publicly is they don't want to show their vulnerability. They want to talk about the 5, 6, 7% growth in African countries, much of it from extractives. And that Africa's on the move. It's Africa's 50th anniversary of the African Summit. And I understand that. They want to change the image of Africa as being a basket case, as being hopeless, etc. So at the very time when they should be telling us in no uncertain terms how difficult and how worrying and how much of a risk they already see of not being able to feed their people, of having dramatic changes that they can't plan for, they don't say it. And sometimes I think it's it's also a sort of pride, So on all sides, there's a lack of a kind of straight leadership on this issue. This is the sort of issue that we should be facing in a way that humanity sometimes faces things. When there is a big crisis, like Sandy, it brings out the best in people. You see a wonderful capacity to really be resilient and stretch. That's what we should be doing. We should be coming together as a world as never before. And as yet it isn't happening. So between now and Christiana Figueres would say between now and about September, October 2014, we have to have changed very dramatically in the seriousness with which we take the need for a climate agreement. And that's not very long.
Let me ask you about that, because I remember being up on this very stage 4 years ago in advance of the Copenhagen summit, when that was very present. Excuse me. Present, excuse me, in everyone's minds, and of course it didn't reach its potential, to say the least. Do you think it will be different as we look ahead to COP21 in Paris at the end of 2015? What will lead to different outcomes?
I think it's very important that we learn the lesson of Copenhagen. Yes, there were people on the street marching for climate justice, but there was not a plan for the leaders when they came to Copenhagen. There was a dense set of proposals that nobody could put together in a coherent way, and eventually we got the Copenhagen Accords. But this time, part of the planning, which I think is good, is to have this summit in September of political leaders and business leaders and civil society. And Ban Ki-moon has allocated a day during the UN General Assembly week as that day of a climate summit for those different groups. And what he wants is every government to come saying what they are doing and what they're putting on the table to address this issue. And they want corporations to come and say what they are doing, to give that leadership. And when Christiana Figueres came to the meeting of the elders to get the elders, and we will be talking as elders, I'll be wearing several hats, but she described a sort of bathtub as a simple metaphor, if you like, and that into that bathtub all the commitments of governments and of business. And we know that to stay below 2 degrees Celsius, that we have to get to a certain level in the bathtub. And she said, by September, we'll know, hopefully, what governments are doing and planning to do, what corporations are doing and planning to do, what civil society, etc. But it won't be enough. There'll still be quite a gap if we're to stay below 2 degrees Celsius. But it kind of at least showed that we need to know in more detail what the situation is. I've been to all of the climate conferences since Copenhagen, at Copenhagen, Cancun, Durban, Doha, and I'll be in Warsaw later this month. When I go to these climate conferences, I get infuriated because the negotiators, it's like as if it's a trade agreement. they've got their cards well hidden and they're not showing. And China isn't showing what it's doing. It's blocking something. And the United States has its own problems. And, it's really very infuriating. And you have two sorts of problems. One is that, the leaders of small island states almost cry in the room. They're so desperate for decisions. And those who go from the rich world go without anybody caring what they do. I mean, there's no constituency saying to the Minister of the Environment or Energy from Ireland, when you go there, make sure they don't even know what they're doing at these climate conferences. So that's why we need to have more of a political urgency, because it's about people, that nobody will go to Paris in 2015 without the world watching what they're doing and saying, give us this climate agreement, because otherwise we are not going to have a world for our grandchildren. And our children will be suffering far more than we have done.
Well, there is clearly a mismatch in terms of the structure of these things, and they are approached like a trade deal. And of course, the WTO negotiations didn't end very, very well either.
Well, a trade deal, it doesn't matter, but we're talking about the future of the planet.
This matters for everybody.
Yeah.
That's absolutely right. Let me switch gears a little bit. You have certainly been a very powerful voice on human rights in general, but you've also focused a lot of attention on women's issues. Is there a particular women's dimension to climate justice, and do you see different kinds of leadership coming from women on this?
There's a very strong gender dimension to climate. It's very obvious when you realize that climate shocks are undermining poverty. So who holds the family together? Who puts the food on the table? Who are the main farmers in poor developing countries? They may not own the land or have the assets, but they do the farming. Who goes further for water in drought? So women are more affected by climate because of their role in their communities. But women are also the ones who tend to respond to the crisis by forming women's groups, by becoming more resilient. They become the agents of change. I've met a lot of climate-wise women, and they're the ones who've been the stalwarts of their communities. When we had our conference in Dublin, a lot of those participating were women, as it happened, because they can do that. What we decided in my foundation at the beginning, and with support indeed from the Rockefeller Foundation, was to harness women's leadership at two levels. The leadership at a high level and the leadership at the grassroots level. And we took advantage of the fact, in fact, if you go to a climate conference, it's quite a male world. But as it happened, there were 3 women who presided over 3 successive conferences. So Connie Hedegaard in Copenhagen, Patricia Espinosa, the Foreign Minister of Mexico in Cancun, and Maite Mashaban, the Minister for International Cooperation of South Africa in Durban. And those 3 women came together in Cancun and agreed to form a troika. And then around that, we built a troika plus of women leaders on climate change. And we have about half a dozen supportive men. We kind of keep men in their place, but we like to have them, being supportive.
Don't give up on us completely. That's all I ask.
No, but the idea is to have that women's leadership. And we put it to the test last year. We had a planning meeting in September, which Christiana Figueres was also at. And we said, look, there's a 10-year-old decision which says in a weak way that women should be more represented in delegations to the climate conference. Women should be more in the structures, the Green Climate Fund and all these structures, but it's actually 3%, 6%, very small percentages. So we planned and we strategized, and because we were talking ministers, we were talking players, and we went to the conference in Doha to get gender balance into the agenda. And we almost fell on our noses at the beginning because there was a rule that you couldn't introduce a new issue into a climate conference and get a result. You could only get a result at the next conference. And when Christiana Figueres...
Doesn't sound like the fierce urgency of now, that process.
Exactly. And I said to Christiana Figueres, but we've been planning this for months. She said, Mary, I know. It was a lawyer from the commission who found this clause and nobody else had seen, And I said, well, she said, it's almost impossible. So I said, well, Christiana, define almost. And she said, well, if the president of the conference were to say, this is of sufficient importance, there's support for it on the floor, he could refer it on. So we got this man from Doha, the minister, to do a very important thing for gender, and we got gender balance into the climate conference, which actually is extraordinarily important. And now gender is a standard item for the first time in climate conferences, will be in Warsaw. And it isn't just, kind of politically correct language. This matters deeply because of the gender impacts, and because women have to become agents of change in their communities and be supported, and be supported with more focus on adaptation and resilience.
I'm going to ask you one more question. I'm sure there are quite a lot of people who would like to ask you some questions as well, so I don't want to monopolize the dialogue here. Let me ask you this question before inviting others in. As you've been working on climate justice the past few years, what has surprised you the most? What did you not expect, positive or negative, that you've seen happen?
I think what surprises me most is the lack of leadership. I don't understand it. I really don't understand it, because this is so serious. I mean, the fifth assessment report is a nightmare to read if you're a grandmother.
Or grandchild.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, I'm very glad, and it gives me some hope, that young people get it much more. I mean, there's a real generation difference, and that gives me hope. But the trouble is, they probably won't be in positions of power soon enough. And we're bringing this troika of women leaders to Warsaw to join with a group called Youngos on intergenerational justice, and we're highlighting that in a meeting that we're doing with the government of Poland. It's a sort of way of trying to bring home this urgency, this fierce urgency of now. It really surprises me. Surely we're not that stupid. I mean, and it is that. It is a failure to see it. And there's so much more attention politically to the very important post-2015 agenda, but it doesn't make sense if we don't have the rigor of staying below 2 degrees Celsius. It actually it's talk, and it's not very sustainable unless we do the other part. And so I find myself, and not only do I find myself frustrated, I can sense it in Christiana Figueres. When we meet, we sort of, kind of almost have to support each other. And I find myself more and more quoting Desmond Tutu. I was on a panel with him over a year ago, and a journalist asked him somewhat, aggressively almost, Archbishop, why are you so optimistic? What makes you so optimistic? And he looked at her, and in some surprise, and said, "Oh no, I'm not an optimist. I'm a prisoner of hope." So when it comes to, what's going to happen in the next less than 2 years, I'm a prisoner of hope that we'll get it right by Paris in 2015.
I hesitate to say in the state of California that we should all be prisoners, but because many of us in California are in prison. But that's very, very eloquent. Let me see who would like to ask Mary a question. We've got one right over there.
Hello, Clifford Moss from Good Business Matters. Firstly, thank you, Mary, for bringing a very real feeling into the arena. Secondly, I've got 2 questions for you, and if you choose not to answer the first, I quite understand, but I'd really like an answer to the second. Firstly, I'm an Englishman and I live in Australia. I'd like to hear your view on the backtrack on carbon tax. Secondly, being brought up by a ferocious French woman and an even more ferocious French grandmother who passed away last year at the age of 105, the expectations were always very clear. As a grandmother and as an elder stateswoman, with all these ears of the choir that you've been preaching to, what do you expect of them when they go back to work on Monday?
Okay. I'm prepared to answer both questions unequivocally. I am dismayed about what has happened in Australia. because it is a country already affected by climate change and quite vulnerable to it. And I feel for the citizens of that country that the wrong policy is going to make life much tougher for many of the people. And also, I regret it very much because carbon tax is one of the ways we need to go. It's one of the ways we can more rapidly go in the right direction. So Ireland has a carbon tax. I would like to see more countries have carbon taxes, and to see a country, a developed country, move back from that, and a prime minister in denial is really very sad, and quite, you know, quite serious. I would hope that, you know, arising out of this, that the way in which I've conveyed the message is one of energizing you, not depressing you that this is terrible, because that actually is the wrong message. And sometimes, you know, I can tend to put that message too much. The real truth is there's a huge opportunity of moving to low-carbon future. I mean, let me talk about the opportunity from a climate justice perspective. Think what it would mean to the 1.3 billion people who don't use electricity, who have kerosene or candles, both of which are dangerous and expensive, actually, for very poor people. They spend too much on the kerosene and candles. And yet we have increasingly the D-lights. Think about the proportion of the population of the world that still cooks on open fires. 2.7 billion out of a world of 7 billion. And we know that there are now, according to a recent report in The Lancet, 4 million deaths a year from ingesting fumes, unnecessary, and their mothers or children beside the mothers while they're cooking. So, you know, the potential to change those lives, but also the jobs that can come. And, you know, I think there's a huge potential. So what I would like from BSR is that you go with a real sense of, we can actually do something. We can change this, and we can influence, because politicians are influenced by what the business community is saying. I mean, it's a two-way process. Government also has the responsibility with regulations, with signals that can be given, policy signals. But you know, if the business community is taking this seriously enough and talking it up in a serious way, which is what the Secretary General very much wants at the summit next September, then that will help. And it's actually business that will take a lot of the steps that we need to take at the end of the day, but will do it quicker if they get the right signals, including things like carbon taxes.
Well, I think that's right, and we've talked throughout the conference about the progress, in some cases remarkable progress, in reducing poverty over the last 3 decades, and we can't afford to have that reversed. And that's a positive agenda. That's about keeping progress going, and I do think that's a potent message. Who has another question? Yes. Yes, right there, sir.
I'm David Peart from Sustainability Transitions, and just like to thank you very much for bringing that quote from Martin Luther King about the ferocity and the intensity and the immediacy of our challenges now, this acute awareness of where we are in the history of the species and the planet. And I think over the last couple of days here at these BSR networking meetings, there's been just so much evidence of that feeling, of that ferocity and that intensity, and especially in the millennial generation, about corporate challenges and what corporations can do, and collaborations between corporations and NGOs. One thing, though, that most Americans don't think about, and I think most in the business world don't think a whole lot about, is the big challenges of international development and the role that the United Nations plays. Just in the last month, I've been at a couple of meetings, the Rio Plus 20 to 2015, one at Yale and a previous one at Columbia. And it struck me very much at those meetings that there was there also that ferocity of and immediacy of challenges, but in a kind of different context. And they seem like almost like parallel universes, what we're seeing here and what seeing in that community in terms of working with international development. And at those meetings, there are several high-level UN folks, leaders in various capacities, And of course, a lot of discussion about the Sustainable Development Goals, the post-2015, and also with the climate agenda and how those two come together. And some of those, in one of the panels...
Sir, I'm really sorry. Can we get to the question?
Yes,
Because
okay.
I want to make sure that
Sorry.
we give more people a chance.
Yep. In one of the panels, those UN folks were saying, okay, when it comes to negotiations around the Millennium Development Goals and the climate goals, that there tends to be a kind of a race to the bottom because the negotiators, the national representatives, have to deal with so many complexities and so many constraints from their governments that there tends to be a race to the bottom. And what they need is the private sector and civil societies in these different nations to be holding them to high standards. And so...
Please, the question. I'm
So
really sorry.
how can you inspire and help to facilitate folks in the private sector and in civil society to do that, to play that role in helping to avoid the race to the bottom in these UN negotiations?
Well, certainly I do agree with the need, I would say, and the value of that influencing by the business sector and also civil society. And I think that's why Ban Ki-moon himself didn't decide just to have a conference, a summit rather, of political leaders. He deliberately said he wants all three, business, political leaders and civil society, in order that there will be the kind of cross-influencing that you spoke about. I'm very pleased to learn, and I'm not surprised, that there is that sense of the fierce urgency of now in this BSR meeting, because the evidence is so overwhelming at this stage, and it's coming from different perspectives and different tipping points, and we're not fools, but to me, maybe we can take some lessons from the idea of networking. I actually think that we almost need a movement with different elements in it to ensure that we get the political decisions in a very short time, because we're not talking 2015 really, we're talking 2014, the end of 2014, which is this time next year. And that's not a lot of time to galvanize a sufficient response at the political level, particularly, as I say, because there are all kinds of different factors. There's the reluctance of many developing country leaders to show their vulnerability, to show their weakness, if you like, that they're damaged already by climate. So we have to find an encouraging way where they can speak out and still have a positive image of their country. So I think it's really important that we address this in a way of seeing it as being a movement of people to get a safe world, to get a safe world. People may think we still have a safe world. We don't. We have a world that is becoming potentially very unsafe, and so it's it's as fundamental as that.
Well, our global governance models are 20th century models. I wonder if we don't need a 21st century movement that takes advantage of social media and all the global
Absolutely.
connections that exist, because my sense is that the models constructed in the last century would move much more quickly if they were pushed by 21st century models. Who else would like to ask a question? Can't see very well.
Down
Over to the side here. Thanks, Allison.
Val Fishman, Bonneville Environmental Foundation. Speaking to the people in this room and talking about carbon tax, obviously Microsoft was a leader in what they did in implementing their own self-imposed carbon tax. And I'm just wondering about your opinion on how that may influence policy if more businesses were to do that.
Yeah, I must say, I think it would be good if the ICT sector would actually come together and think about this. And Microsoft has given some leadership, as you say, in that area. I think it really would be good because the ICT sector uses a lot of energy and will use more because it's a growing area, it's innovative, but it's also an area for solutions, for innovation. And I think precisely it's one of the constituencies that could move this agenda if it gave that kind of leadership.
I think there was another question right close by. Yeah.
Mark Bauhaus, Just Business. You talked about reframing climate change in a different way, and I don't quite get what you're suggesting. We still smacks of the tragedy of the commons, the issue that's far away from me, and I don't have to worry about it. And I know this room's preaching to the converted, but how would you reframe this to talk differently and have a different dialogue over the next year and tee up the issue in a way that, as Aaron suggested, might have a different outcome and a different dialogue around it?
Well, thank you for the challenge of that, because I have to say we sit sometimes in our foundation and challenge ourselves about whether we're communicating effectively in the way we want to. And clearly I haven't communicated effectively to you. But what worries me about the discussions on climate change is that it's seen as being a difficult issue, a contentious issue, and it's about science, which until recently was contested. I think it's much less contested now, except for the role of some deniers and a lot of money being spent. It reminds me a bit of the tobacco industry controversy, the money that's been spent to muddy the science and try and delete. But what I'm saying, and I'm just interested that it hasn't got through to you as well as I thought it would. We're talking about people, millions of people worldwide who are suffering already from climate shocks, who haven't been responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions because they haven't had the benefit of fossil fuel development in their economy or in their lifestyles, in fact. And they're giving us an indication of what we're all going to face. That's combined with the intergenerational justice argument, if you like. But I think that in itself is not sufficient. That's the sort of moral argument, the moral imperative argument, which the elders will certainly be making over the next time. But we also want to make a can-do argument. We can actually resolve this issue in a good way by moving rapidly to a low-carbon future. And there's every reason to do this because of the risks of carbon-intensive assets. This is no longer acceptable or tolerable from a risk perspective. So companies will face regulation risks, direct regulation, pollution controls, mandates on renewable energy, etc. There are market forces. Capital is going to move increasingly to renewables. I think that that's going to happen very dramatically in the not too distant future. There are socio-political pressures where, in a way, carbon-intensive business will become, the pariah of business because of what it's doing to our world. So I think, to me, the best way I'm trying to communicate is, yes, there is a moral imperative because of the damage it's doing to those we care about, because we have good policies to tackle poverty. We have our development aid, but it is being undermined and will be completely wiped out if we continue, if we don't address this problem. And secondly, there's the fact that those are the very people that can benefit most if we move to a low-carbon world, because they will, for the first time, have clean energy. And, women will have time on their hands to be productive. Children will study with light in the evening. There's a huge beneficial impact of having access to energy. I think the mobile phone has probably been the best way of showing us that. So, we don't have any option. I think that's another part of the message. We don't have a choice about this. We are faced with a situation that demands that complete necessity to act. So I'm not sure how to communicate it better.
Well, we have done big things before. When you became the High Commissioner for Human Rights, there were very few companies who took an explicit approach to protecting human rights, and now hundreds of companies do. In this country, the air and the water was considerably dirtier when I was growing up than it is today. And we are healthier, and the environment is healthier. So we do know how to do big things when we turn our attention to it.
And actually, you've reminded me, a part of what I was saying earlier, that for those companies who have been using the UN guiding principles, I think they fit perfectly to look at the climate justice dimension as well, factor it in. I think it works very well.
Any closing words, Mary? Unfortunately, we're out of time.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's disgraceful to be here for such a short time, because I'm departing after this and leaving San Francisco again, having arrived this morning. But I do regard this business for social responsibility and the networking approach that you highlight as being a very important factor in the way in which business and human rights has developed. And you're quite right, Aaron. When I started as High Commissioner for Human Rights, it was a small unit in the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, and it was all about business is the problem. Business violates human rights. Look at the indigenous people, look at the extractive industries, and there was no sense of the positive. And it was partly the Global Compact, but it was, I think, even more than that, the way in which business itself recognized the need to have appropriate responsibility, and then the work done by John Ruggie, the UN Guiding Principles, helped the initiatives like the Business Leaders Initiative on Human Rights, and now the Institute for Human Rights in Business, and BSR. These are leaders in seeking to move this agenda forward. And I think it's a very good arena to think in terms of how we talk about climate in a different way, how we make it a responsibility of all corporations. Are we doing what we should be doing? Because the consequences for all of us, but the immediate consequences for those least responsible, are very serious. And and I wish you well in the remainder of the conference. I know it has a bit to go yet. And well, I hope I've been bossy enough, have I?
Well, I was going to say we will all do well to listen to Mary Robinson, as I think everyone in this room knows. But now we also know that we will do well to think of Mary Robinson's 4 and soon to be 5 grandchildren, because we're doing it for them and all of their generational peers. Mary, thank you so much for being with us. Please join me.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.